Well, welcome to the 700 Club. Unexpected devastation. The remnants of Hurricane Ida shocked the East Coast with record-breaking rain, flash floods, and tornadoes. The storm killed at least 46 people from Maryland to Connecticut. And on top of that, Ida has cost an estimated $18 billion in insured damage. Mark Martin has that story.
Forecasters warned people from the mid-Atlantic to the Northeast about the potential for deadly flash flooding, but the region did not expect such an intense storm system. The remnants of Hurricane Ida merged with a front, resulting in a first-time ever flash flood emergency for all 5 boroughs. In Central Park, Father Tasco Brown swam through the floodwaters to safety while carrying his 8-month-old boy.
I just used the God-given strength that I had and had to pull him out. Never experienced nothing like it. It was frightening. Yeah, worst thing I've ever seen.
The floods overwhelmed the entire New York City subway system, forcing officials to shut it down. The NYPD says 835 subway passengers had to be rescued, and people abandoned nearly 500 vehicles across the city. In Connecticut, a state trooper lost his life while checking on conditions. Floodwaters swept his patrol car away where 3 rivers come together.
He's one of the senior sergeants on the state police, well respected, and it's just a tragedy.
In Philadelphia, residents made hundreds of calls for water rescues. The Schuylkill River flooded the area with the water rising as high as this overpass. At a Pennsylvania apartment complex, the National Guard rescued around a dozen people and their pets.
We really appreciate it. You know, you don't really expect these types of things to happen when, you're in a big building like this.
And in Louisiana, where Ida came ashore, New Orleans residents facing long lines at gas stations and grocery stores. CBN's Operation Blessing is set up in Houma, Louisiana, giving away generators and Home Depot flood buckets and tarps. And the help is necessary. One early estimate says the insured losses from Ida will come in around $18 billion in damages. The final number could be higher. Ida came ashore with some of the strongest winds ever and leaving behind a trail of devastation, with much of New Orleans still lacking power and running water. And Ida's impact has been felt from Louisiana and Mississippi and the Gulf Coast all the way to the Northeast. Forecasters say most rivers in the mid-Atlantic and southern New England will return to their banks today, but high water may remain in areas with drainage issues. Mark Martin, CBN News.
Thanks, Mark. We at CBN care very much about the suffering that's going on, and our Operation Blessing is now set up to bring relief supplies, bottled water, non-perishable food, tarps, generators, and Home Depot food flood buckets. And if you want to participate in helping these people in the Northeast and in the South area hit by Ida, you can call CBN Center, Virginia Beach. It's Disaster Relief Fund. And boy, you can thank the Lord that you're still living, but this was one of the worst in our recent history. It's just a terrible, terrible thing. And it hasn't happened. They say this is worse than Sandy Hook in New York. But you can imagine the whole subway being flooded and shut down. It's unreal. Well, in other news, a surprising move by Israel this week, offering economic aid to the Palestinian Authority. So far, that decision is getting mixed reviews. The question is, did the White House pressure Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett to make this overture to the Palestinians? Chris Mitchell takes us a look.
In what some would call an about-face, Israel is offering economic assistance to the Palestinian Authority and easing its blockade of the Gaza Strip. While it could indicate an Israeli and U.S. policy change toward Palestinians, it's also an attempt to weaken Hamas.
Our declared goal is to do whatever is possible to improve the life of Palestinians in terms of the economy, security, also self-governance, and also public health and fighting the pandemic. And Israel has approved a series of measures to improve the economic situation.
The measures include a $150 million loan, as well as authorizing work permits for an additional 15,000 Palestinians to work inside Israel. The move follows a surprise meeting between Defense Minister Benny Gantz and PA Chairman Mahmoud Abbas, the highest level meeting between the sides in more than 10 years. Former Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, says while this coordination is necessary, he believes the high-profile meeting was out of line.
We have to remember that President Abbas still supports terrorism. They pay salaries to convicted terrorists, and I don't think he deserves the respect he got from Minister Gantz.
Danon says there may have been pressure from Washington since the meeting happened shortly after Bennett's meeting with President Biden.
And I'm sure this issue was also brought up in the discussions between President Biden and Prime Minister Bennett.
Foreign Minister Yair Lapid confirmed this move doesn't mean negotiations are resuming. Still, Lapid says Israel is not interested in weakening the PA.
I am a devoted believer in the two-state solution. I think this is the right solution. But we'll have to admit to the fact this is not feasible in the current situation.
Reserve Major General Eitan Dan-Goat is former coordinator of government activities in the territories. He believes the meeting highlights the importance of the West Bank to Israel and is meant to strengthen Abbas against Hamas.
Hamas used the last escalation on May as the top of the interest around the Palestinian issue. They took the leadership and they were put themselves as those who are, let's say, carrying and serving the Palestinian people.
While the PA rules Palestinian areas in the West Bank, Hamas is gaining power there. Hamas, which is dedicated to Israel's destruction, has ruled Gaza since 2007, when it seized control from a PA faction.
We are not interested in going back to Gaza. We are not interested in choking Gaza in sieges. We just want to make sure nobody's firing rockets and missiles on us. And if Hamas will guarantee peace and quiet, they can guarantee also the functioning economy and humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News.
Thanks, Chris. Well, with us now from Tel Aviv is the former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Michael Oren. Michael, thanks so much for being with us. They just, under the Trump administration, signed the Abraham Accords with people like Bahrain and others, and they totally bypassed the Palestinian Authority because it had always been a block to any peace. How come they're now coming in and offering peace to the Palestinian Authority? I don't understand it.
Good to be with you, Pat. Well, we don't understand it much either, to tell you the truth. The Palestinians hold the world record of a people who have been offered a two-state solution and have turned it down, usually turned it down with violence, going back to the 1930s, believe it or not, the first time they were offered a two-state solution. It's a shame. And I really think the United States should be investing in the Abraham Accords, expanding them to include countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and building a regional peace that would serve as a bulwark against Iran, against Sunni extremists backed by Turkey, like the Muslim Brotherhood, and also perhaps find a framework for advancing peace with the Palestinians. But trying to work on that sort of bilateral track, people have been trying this for 30 years, Pat. I've been involved in just about all those efforts. I was an ambassador at Yitzhak Rabin back in the early 90s. It's not going to work because the Palestinians are either incapable of signing on the dotted line or they don't want to.
What is going on? Is this pressured by Biden, or does Naftali Bennett really think it's going to be successful?
I think it's pressure, for the Democratic Party, from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which is highly critical of Israel, which is putting pressure on the administration to put pressure on Israel. The big issue coming up will be whether the United States will seek to reopen a U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem, which prior to the Trump administration for decades served as a de facto American embassy to the Palestinians. You know, if you went on the website of that consulate, you'd never know there was a Jew in the entire city of Jerusalem, much less that the city was under Israeli sovereignty. You'd never know that. And if that consulate is reopened, that will essentially mean a withdrawal of America from its recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's united capital. It'll be in a sort of de facto way redividing the city. And I think that no Israeli government should ever agree to that.
Well, don't you think there's time? I mean, the Saudis really want to start making peace with Israel, and the other Arab countries do. And to have this group blocking again, I can't understand it. And there's no way there's going to be a two-state solution, is there?
The Palestinians, no one's listening. We keep on offering the two-state solution. They keep on turning it down. As I said, they turn it down mostly with violence. So they're trying to tell us something, and no one's listening. I think it's a great tragedy, actually a tragedy for the Palestinians, a tragedy for Palestinians and Israelis alike, that governments in Europe and here the United States government wants to give the Palestinians a veto power over peace. They're saying, well, if the Palestinians don't want peace, there's not going to be peace anywhere else. No, bring peace elsewhere. Bring it with Israel and Bahrain, as you mentioned, Pat, with the UAE, with Morocco, and hopefully later with Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and other Arab countries. Bring all that together. Then go to the Palestinians and say, okay, you want something that looks like a state? You're going to have to work through a regional framework because clearly you are not capable of doing it alone. And I don't know if that sounds patronizing, but that's the only way it's going to work because the Palestinians, I said before, historically, repeatedly, have proven that they are either unwilling or incapable of negotiating for their own independence.
Michael, I'm totally agree with you. I am amazed and just shocked. But if that's what the Democrats are pushing, I hope that Bennett and those other guys will stand firm against the nonsense that's coming out of this Biden administration. But Michael Oren, thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Bless you all. Have a big day. Bye-bye.
Deliberate interference. Deliberate interference. Guess what? Interference with what? Our own government. The government of Biden has tried to keep from evacuating people from Afghanistan. Well, despite the roadblocks, private evacuation efforts have helped thousands to escape. And they're not done yet. Caitlin Burke has more on what's being called Afghanistan's version of the Underground Railroad.
The State Department says the mission in Afghanistan is complete. The focus now shifting to diplomacy. But for the hundreds of American citizens and thousands of Afghan allies still trying to get out of the country, the war isn't over.
People are dying right now, and many more will die because they can't get out of there. They're trapped.
President Biden touted the U.S. evacuation effort as the largest of its kind. While that may be true, thousands who should have gotten out were turned away. Representative Michael McCall worked for days to evacuate 250 Christian orphans in an Afghan girls' choir.
They had visas. They had a private plane waiting for them. The Taliban actually let them through. And then our own United States government turned them away after sitting there for a day, back to the Taliban.
Joel Richardson with Global Catalytic Ministries says their rescue efforts faced what felt like deliberate interference each step of the way from the State Department.
Even to the point where Albania had cleared a plane of refugees and they were in the air and the State Department refused to let them land. They actually had to turn around and go back. So what you're hearing in the news in terms of this great evacuation versus what we were seeing on the ground, it was night and day.
The bureaucratic holdups and other roadblocks caused by official evacuation channels forced lawmakers like McCall to take matters into their own hands.
Almost running like a parallel government operation to go in and save lives because our own government was not doing an adequate job.
Private operations also bypassing the U.S. government. One of the most successful, known as the Commercial Task Force, was made up of thousands of volunteers. It originally formed to rescue a small group of children. It eventually evacuated more than 5,000 Afghans.
We really tried to target the people that we thought were the highest risk for anything that, by the Taliban's declaration would be considered a target.
Another well-known operation, Pineapple Express, involved current and former U.S. special operators, aid workers, and intelligence officers. So far, they've brought more than 1,000 people to safety, and their effort is ongoing. Team members saying measures are in place to continue facilitating evacuations. Global Catalytic Ministries will also continue their rescue efforts.
We're essentially establishing an underground railroad. It's a matter of finding a network of safe locations, getting them places where they can sort of lay low in the interim, Little by little, we've run over 50 operations so far.
While much of the ministry's effort is focused on helping people escape, Richardson says about 30% of the Christians in their underground church network actually want to stay.
In fact, we have some of our leaders that were out of the country when the Taliban takeover took place, and they actually have gone back into the country because they're so zealous to see the church continue to expand, to see disciples made.
Now, McCall says that he plans to hold the administration accountable, and his committee is going to be holding oversight hearings to get to the bottom of this. Pat?
Caitlin, I am simply overwhelmed with grief at the fact that we would surrender what amounts to thousands of people who had worked with us, and also leaving behind a number of Americans who may become hostages. But the fact that a plane load of people who had been cleared were actually turned back by our State Department, by Blinken and his crowd, I can't understand it. Do you have any concept of why it happened?
You know, Pat, that's the question that everybody wants to know, and it doesn't make any sense. These groups that I spoke with, not a single one felt like the U.S. government was supporting them, and many of those people were lawmakers. So they've got, you know, Representative McCall says he has top connections at the Pentagon, top connections in the State Department, and he was running into those same roadblocks. So none of these people understand it. None of these groups felt like the government was working with them, and so eventually they all switched to different methods. You know, the commercial task force said they actually had people in the State Department who they were asking, like, how can we get around this? You're part of our task force. What do we need to do? And their hands were tied. They had no answers. So, you know, somebody who's able to go to those state briefings, they're not letting me go right now, needs to be asking those questions because it's unacceptable.
What about the status of Christians still in Afghanistan?
Right. So right now, we're actually hearing that SIV applicants, anyone who worked with the United States, is the Taliban's top priority. Christians are the second priority. And the Taliban is sending known Christians messages and basically saying, we know where you are, we know who you are, and we're coming back for you. So Christians are running for the hills. Some of them are just changing locations frequently. And Pat, we're actually hearing that some Christians are boldly going to the Taliban in their communities and evangelizing to them.
Caitlin, fabulous story. Thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, one more time, I have said it before, our president is either totally incompetent or he is totally evil. I don't understand. But can you imagine a plane load of people who'd been cleared to leave the country and who were getting out are being turned around by our government, our State Department, and made to go back to certain death in Afghanistan? Can you imagine anything as monstrous as that? You say, how could it possibly be? You know, today is a day that I can't understand what's going on. I cannot understand this so-called two-state solution, and the fact we're pressing from that from the United States government. It's not going to work, as Michael Oren pointed out. They've tried and tried and tried. It won't happen. The same thing here. But what is the matter? It has been one of the greatest diplomatic disasters in the history of the United States. And our enemies around the world are now emboldened. They don't fear us anywhere. The Russians don't fear us. The Chinese don't fear us. Nobody does, because we are in the hands of a feckless group of people who apparently are turning against our best interests. And you say, what in the world are we in, have we given up our country to? But it's happening, and you know, there's no way that they can be impeached. Many people think that Biden and his crew should resign. But now this latest disaster from Blinken and his crowd in the State Department is simply unacceptable.